Oh, so we have a bit more latitude.
I've no objection if you want to take 3.
Yeah. Given that there's nobody else here, the Taoiseach 2 issues then I'd like to... First of all, taxi drivers, a group I've raised many times, as you know. There's deep concern among taxi drivers about something of a campaign which seems to involve some of the ride-hailing apps like Uber and others to suggest that we're chronically short of taxis, and essentially implying that we need to deregulate the taxi industry and develop the Uber model that exists elsewhere. And the taxi drivers are very concerned about that. So I think they'd like assurance that that's not, we're not going to go down that road, because first of all, if you go out of this building now, you will find actually on many taxi ranks there's lines of taxi drivers without fares. So for much of the time, there isn't work available for taxi drivers. There are pinch points they would acknowledge, but they feel it is completely wrong that the lack of public transport, particularly nighttime public transport like buses and so on, at sufficient quantity and frequency, that deficiency shouldn't be landed on their door, that it's not really fair to blame them for that problem. And that if we deregulate, and deregulation was done before in this area and it really had quite disastrous consequences, people who, for example, forked out huge amounts of money to buy new electric vehicles or buy new taxis won't be able to make the income in order to repay huge loans they've taken out on those taxis. And they also say that the reluctance of some taxi drivers to work at night is to do with safety issues, and indeed we've seen bus workers now talking about similar safety issues. And again, if you like, safety problems late at night it's not the taxi driver's fault any more than it's a bus worker's fault. These are issues that have to be addressed by the government, by the NTA, by the guards and so on, rather than landed at their door. And critically indeed, in terms of the safety of passengers, they point out when you get into a properly regulated taxi, you know who your taxi driver is. You know that they are the taxi driver they're supposed to be, that they have the knowledge and so on. Whereas if you go down the totally deregulated Uber road, it can actually compromise the safety of passengers. So for all these reasons, what they're really asking is if there's any if issues need to be addressed in this area, that the NTA or other bodies should be engaging with the taxi representative groups, and they're more than willing to discuss these issues, but there should be no question of the sort of totally deregulated model. Just one other thing, just to maybe mention to you briefly, there's a huge backlog in people getting their driving tests, right? A huge backlog. In my area, it's a year. Sometimes it means people can't take up jobs, which they've got, and so on. And one of the problems is that we're relying too much on, if you like, temporary contracts for drive testers, right? And they're not taking enough full-time people on, and it's something the union has raised. I would ask you to look at that as well.
Thanks, Deputy O'Connor.
Once again, I want to thank the deputies for their questions. Deputy Boyd Barrett raised the issue of ride-sharing, and perhaps I can give some assurance to taxi drivers in that regard. It's something that I think all of us have used when we're abroad. Generally speaking, I think it's a very good service. I've used Uber, I've used Bolt, I've used Lyft, and with one exception, I found that it was a very good service. But I do have concerns around deregulation. First of all, it would mean that the drivers are not vetted, not regulated, at least not by a public authority, and would mean that the vehicles would not be checked by a public authority. So we don't propose to move down that road here in Ireland, but I do think we should try to make it easier for people to provide a service, particularly at peak times when it's needed most. But that is not full deregulation, and we're not proposing that, and I wouldn't support it. In terms of driving test backlogs, this is something we're working on at the moment. Staffing has been increased. There's a backlog that relates to the pandemic, but also like with so many things, a big increase in demand for tests, but I'm confident now it is going to come down over the next few months. In relation to Deputy Connor's question on Middleton and the Cork floods after Storm Babette, I understand the Council has calculated that about 54 million will be needed to repair the roads and indeed other public infrastructure. So far, a special allocation has been made of 14 million to the Council, but it is possible for more to be provided, and I expect that will happen. The Department of Transport, though, will have to cross-check the Council's assessment. It is ultimately central funds and taxpayers' money, so they'll have to do due diligence on it, but I'm sure a further allocation can be made and should be. I'd be happy to follow it up with Deputy Connor and Deputy Stanton too.